All right, this will be part 2 of making a composite image. In the last tutorial, we showed how to isolate an apple using a mask and the magic wand tool. In the future, I'll show other selection methods, but right now I want to concentrate just on making this apple look a little bit more realistically placed in the environment. So one of the things I'm noticing is I'm looking at the light coming into the background, and I'm looking at the light as it hits the apple, and they don't seem to match up. Let me show you what I mean. First, I'm going to go up to the Move tool to move the apple out of the way. Probably move it here somewhere. And notice what's happening. When the light hits, I can tell the light's coming in from the left because the shadow on the tracks is on the right-hand side. But when I look at the apple, it seems like the apple is being lit from coming in from the right. And so we have this disparity. And often in introductory or beginning composites, sometimes you'll have this error of the light being in one direction for the object and the other direction for the background. So this is a simple fix. All I have to do is reverse the orientation of the apple to get a more realistic look. And the best way to do that is with the apple selected, the apple layer selected, go up to Edit, Transform, and flip horizontal. Flipping horizontal will flip the apple, and the apple will now be registering a little bit more accurately. The light coming in on the apple is the same as the light coming in on the background. Notice that the mask also flips because they're linked, so I don't have to worry about that, thank goodness. Now the other issue that I have to worry about is where to place the apple. I could have it kind of hanging over here by the tracks. I could maybe have it here in the middle of the tracks. That might work out pretty well. The one place I can't really have it is kind of sitting on top of the tracks. That just wouldn't do. I'm going to try the middle of the tracks in the front right now and see how that looks, but I can always change that if I need to. One of the things I'm noticing with my apple being placed here is there's no sense of my apple actually resting on the ground. Where my apple would touch, you would usually see a shadow. So the next thing I have to do is actually create a shadow. The way I do that is I would take my apple that I have right here and I would duplicate it, and in the duplication I can actually turn it into a black apple, which will then function as a shadow. So let me show you how I do that. I duplicate the apple through dragging the apple down over the new layer mask, which makes a new duplicate copy of the apple. Now, layer order is important. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change the layer underneath rather than the top apple layer, and this will allow me to make changes that seem to be sitting underneath the apple, which is what a shadow would do. So the first thing is I'd turn off the visibility of the true apple layer so I can see the other apple. And I'm going to do some work on this. I'm going to first select the mask, and then remember my magic wand tool? My magic wand tool inside the apple. Now notice, since I'm in the mask, and I'll show you what the mask looks like by pressing the Option key, I have this area, and I'm going to select contiguous because I just basically want that. And notice what I've selected. I've selected just the apple. I'm going to hit the Option key again to hit the whole thing. So with the whole apple selected, now I'm going to go down to make an adjustment layer. And remember, if I have a selection with the adjustment layer on, when I hit the adjustment layer, it'll automatically assume that I want that mask on. So I'm going to hit Threshold, and I have this apple, and I'm going to move the threshold slider so the entire apple is black. There we go. This doesn't work if you haven't had the selection on first, remember the marching ants, and then afterward choose the adjustment layer. If you just do one, then what's going to happen is you're going to end up with black everywhere. All right, So now I have this black apple, and there's an adjustment layer turning the apple black. If I turn it off, the apple is still black. Now what I kind of want to do right now is there seems to be a lot going on, so I'm going to select both of these by shift clicking, and then I'm going to go to Layer, and I'm going to go to Merge Layers, which is going to just turn that into one layer. This will then, I'm going to collapse that. This will then serve as the apple shadow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the apple. Remember, the top layer is above the bottom layer. Now with the bottom layer still selected, I'm going to go to the edit mode, and I'm going to go to edit, and I'm going to go to transform, and here I like to go to distort, because you will be distorting this shadow to make it look realistic. So I'm going to go to distort, and I'm going to play around with it. So I'm going to start moving it to see what's happening. Notice it's an afternoon, the sun is a raking light coming in from the right, so I'm probably going to orient my apple this way, and I'm just going to drag on the corners and until I see something that looks like the shadow that I want. And because I have this these angles, I can do pretty much whatever I want. I'm going to lay it down a little bit more, kind of like that. Maybe lay it down further, right? Because the shadow is really going to be behind the apple, but significantly almost 90 degrees to the apple. Right? Maybe pull this edge out. I can tweak that quite a bit. And there's the rail, and I'm going to have to deal with the rail at some point, but not just yet. Alright. Something like that. Alright, so once I have it the shape I want, and again I can move it around a little bit if I want later, I just hit return to isolate that. Now right now it doesn't look quite like the object that I want for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a massive black and it covers everything up. I want something to be significantly more transparent, and it doesn't fringe around the edges as a shadow would. So I have to kind of fix this shadow. And so this is how I do that. The first thing I can play around with just a little bit is opacity on that layer, so I can just bring the opacity down. And that goes some way to making things work. But I'm going to really want to blur the edges, and I want to have some control over that. Remember, the only way I can do that is if I turn this into a smart object. Right now it's not a smart object. Go up to this pull-down menu, go to Convert to Smart Object, and what that allows me to do is that when I go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, I can play around with the blur. That's too much. I want some definition. What's happening? Maybe something like that, and hit OK. Alright, so already that's starting to look a little bit more realistic. It's kind of integrating with the background a little bit more. Now, the other thing that happens, if you'll notice, is usually a shadow when it's really close underneath the object, it's dark, and then it kind of fades out. That's not really happening right now. So what I want to do is I want to fade out the edges. Basically, I do not want to blur out I don't want to black out this. That would be your first assumption because that is my Gaussian blur. But if you think about it, if I use a black paintbrush here, I'm going to just make the edges harder because what this Gaussian blur, what this will do is take away the Gaussian blur. What I really want to do, and this gets a little complicated, is I want to mask the object, which is the shadow, not the Gaussian blur itself. So I go up to the actual smart object, which is again that black shadow, and then I go back here and I make a mask there. So now I have another mask. But what this does is I'm going to slowly fade away the actual object. So with my paintbrush selected, and this at 52, maybe 32, I'm going to go down to 22. I'm going to very slowly fade this away. So this has the added advantage of looking a little bit more realistic. Maybe I faded the stem out too much, so I'm going to reverse it. Bring the stem back in just a little bit. All right. So we now have an apple that is properly oriented, and we have an apple that's throwing a shadow. There might be a little bit more work that I can do on the shadow, and I'm going to talk in other movies about creating an outline that's a little softer to make it a little bit more realistic. But I think we are well on our way to creating a realistic space for this apple.